Welcome, John and Anisio, to our panel discussion about policies and procedures. Let's start by having you each introduce yourself. John?
Hello, I am Dr. John McMahon. I have been in the blindness field for coming up on 39 years and started as a frontline worker, as a vision rehabilitation therapist. Through the years, I've also worked as a low vision therapist and a rehabilitation counselor, a peer mentor, and in middle management and in senior management, administering the programs of a state agency.
Anisio?
So my name is Anisio Correia. I am originally from Portugal, but I really have spent most of my adult life in the United States. I moved here when I was in my 20s after finishing college. I also, like John, started my career as a vision rehab therapist. I received my degree from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock many years ago. Unfortunately, the program no longer exists, but that's what I went. And then throughout my 40+ year career, I've worked always in the private sector, always with the private nonprofit vision rehabilitation organizations or community rehab providers. I had a chance to move around, and after starting as a VRT, both in community and center-based programs, I had a chance to go back to school, get a master's in public administration, and move up in the career ladder, and which really meant moving a lot throughout the East Coast. So I had a chance to work at the Vision Service for the Blind in New York, the IRIS Network in Portland, Maine, the Associated Services for the Blind, now Vision Link in Philadelphia, and most recently at the Center for the Visually Impaired in Atlanta, in Georgia.
Thank you both for being here and agreeing to talk with me about this topic. In your experience, how did the policies or procedures in your organization impact the services that were provided? And John, we'll start with you again.
Well, in my experience, policies and procedures tend to give structure to the ideas of how we want to deliver service. So whether it's the idea at, the old saying, the 30,000 foot level, or an idea or a belief of what we think we ought to be doing right down on the ground level, the policies and procedures, especially those internal ones, act as a set of guidance standards or guidance principles so that staff can easily look at them and say, oh, okay, in this situation, this is what a policy or procedure is. They aren't intended to stop the thinking and the decision-making of our staff. If we have highly qualified and well-trained staff, they can handle all that and should handle all that. But when we get to those situations that aren't clear, that's when you go back to that framework of policies and procedures and look for that structure to help you decide which direction you might have to go on any given issue.
Anisio, from your perspective, how do policies and procedures impact the services provided?
Yeah, I agree with what John said, even from a private sector. Obviously, so two of the organizations that I've worked for sought and maintained national accreditation, which forced us to every 5 years go through all our policies and procedures in the various programs, various departments, and ensure that they were up to date, and then providing annual updates. The other thing that happened was I had a chance to implement two low vision clinics in two different states. and we decided to go after Medicare reimbursement. And obviously, they too have all their own requirements that we had to not only adopt, but ensure that they were consistent with other policies of our organization and the other programs, that it did not create a silos between the low vision clinic and the rehab program, for example. And I think bringing them together not only facilitated our ability to get reimbursement, but I think ultimately, by the attention we lend to the process, it improved the overall services. The other thing that I just want to add is the fact that as a private organization, and the fact that so much of our funding comes from the state, every policy and procedure must be in concert with obviously what the state offers. For example, I'll give you an example. In two of the states, no, actually, no, all of the states I worked in, the state required certification for VRTs and O&M and CLVTs. So all the services that be provided by certified staff, which obviously was a welcoming change or option for us. But again, it dictated the kinds of recruitment we would do, the step qualifications that we would look for, etc. So again, working closely with the state was critical.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Did you implement or have others implement policies? And how did those changes impact the services that you provided? So thinking about a specific change or procedural or policy change that was made. And we'll start with you, Anisio.
Well, probably one of the most controversial and difficult initially, but that proved to be a good change, I think, was one that I made where particularly in both the low vision clinic, actually, yeah, the low vision, all the departments, we decided to create a scheduling unit that was associated with our intake unit. And that scheduling unit was responsible for scheduling staff, scheduling clients, I should say, with staff. So that was easy, certainly, or easier in the center-based component of our programs, like the low vision clinic, the adult rehab. But it was very difficult and highly controversial in our community-based program because staff was so used to making their own schedules and on a weekly basis, etc. So once that we went through the rough period of implementation and getting staff trained, etc., I think the change was welcomed by everybody. It allowed teachers, both direct service providers, more time to provide service with the clients. It took away from their responsibility, and really in many cases busy work, the hours during the week where they would be either on the phone or trying to reach clients to provide the service. Now, obviously, you know, one of the concerns of staff was the fact that we were removing that ability to establish some rapport with a client on the phone, and so we made sure that time was allowed and certainly expected for the instructor to accomplish those kinds of interactions during the face-to-face during that first couple of meetings, etc. So, but that was one that I think worked, and even though it was a bit painful initially.
I can see that from both sides, and I can imagine that was controversial.
Yes.
John, do you have a specific example of something that was implemented and how that went?
Sure. Yeah, I have a handful.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about this one right now. And we were a state agency that required staff working in our blindness agency to have their discipline specific certification. So certification as a vision rehab therapist, certification as a O&M specialist. And early on, if you got hired into our agency or any of our contractors, you had a certain amount of time in which to become certified. And I can't remember if it was 6 months or 9 months, but it was typically around the amount of time as the probationary period. And when recruiting became more difficult, as every agency's got this problem now, is we can't find enough people. Well, we couldn't find enough people either. So we had to figure out ways to work around that. So we created a little wrinkle in our policy that allowed us to hire people for related types of jobs, sort of assistant kind of positions, with the understanding that they would then, upon the time that they accepted the job, they would have to apply for and be accepted to one of the university preparation programs, and that they would finish that program and then become certified. Once they got the training to do the job, then they would be moved into the position where they could then do the full extent of the duties of a vision rehab therapist or O&M specialist. And that worked out pretty well. It helped our recruitment amazingly well, because it helped us home grow people. And we had some very rural areas in our state that it was hard to recruit for, over and above the other areas it was hard to recruit for. So this was an area we hired people who grew up in that area, who had bachelor's degrees in related fields. They started working like in different projects and things like that that we needed some help with. And then they went to university, got trained, took their exam, became certified, and they ended up in sometimes staying with us an entire career of 30 years. So it's an approach that paid immediate dividends. And I've been out of that position, gosh, for 10, 12 years, and it's still paying dividends in that area. So that's one that, we made a little change dictated by getting more boots on the ground, and it worked out pretty well.
Did you want to give a second example, or you're good with one?
I can give you one that didn't work as well.
Okay, sure. We always learn from that too.
So we in recognizing that approximately 90% or so of our clients have some type of usable vision, and our eligibility requirements, although it required documentation from an eye doctor, we didn't have a visual acuity number to make somebody eligible. The person had to have a functional problem based on their vision impairment. So our staff got to go in and find out what the functional issues were based off of a vision impairment that was documented by a doctor. But we realized that every person may be able to benefit from clinical functional vision or low vision evaluations. And many clients were going and some clients weren't going. And we found out over time that some clients weren't even being notified that these services existed. And whether we knew it or not, we were being gatekeepers of the services that somebody might have access to, because some of the staff didn't think that people could afford to buy the devices. And we're talking about our older blind program, where we didn't have the ability to buy very many devices. So in that term, a number of clients weren't really finding out that the services existed. Well, we're a big informed consumer choice agency. And oh, by the way, that's the law. And in order to provide informed consumer choice, we had to really work with our staff to make sure that they were letting every single one of our older blind clients know that here are the set of low vision doctors that you could go to. Here were the expectations. Here's maybe what might help you. Here's what might not. And Medicare would cover the cost of the exam, but you might have to buy your own devices, which could cost, as much money as you wanted to spend, kind of thing. A lot of our staff felt very uncomfortable with that. And so the success of that really depended on our ability to help staff understand what informed consumer choice really meant. And at the time I left the agency, I'm sad to say we still had some staff members who were not letting every client know that that service was available. So I think we would have succeeded with a little more time, but at the time that I left there, we weren't successful. So it's a great idea, was driven by the law and our interpretation of it, but the outcome wasn't as successful as the first example I gave you.
Thank you. And it does, even when we can move incrementally closer to the ideal of what we want to do, it's better than not trying, at least in a situation like that.
Can I add something to that, Kendra?
Sure.
So because it's kind of related. So I absolutely agree with John, and I understand, a lot of us, staff feel very uncomfortable in not only in terms of letting people know about services that we think that may prove to be too expensive for them or result in the need of devices, etc. Similarly, I think sometimes staff are uncomfortable in showing or letting clients know of expensive pieces of equipment that could be helpful, just because they don't think that obviously OIB cannot afford, the agency does not have the funds, and they assume the client does not have the funds either, and it's just going to create frustration. I remember working for an agency that had a store of adapted devices, including a lot of video magnifiers, etc. So, and I can't tell you how many times my staff would recommend to a client a piece of equipment, not because they were afraid of showing them the more expensive one, but because it was the most effective. And then they would go to the store on the way out with a family member, and the family member would purchase the more expensive piece of equipment. So again, I don't think sometimes we really shouldn't shy away from showing the client, what's possible, what exists, and then let them make the decision, even though maybe a decision that, no, I cannot afford that, or maybe my family will do it for Valentine's Day or for next Christmas present.
That's right. We often, and I come from direct service myself, so I understand that push-pull for sure. And we just can't, we cannot possibly know the resources for that individual that might come to bear if we simply inform them of the choices, whether it appears to us from our perspective that that person can afford it or not. Not informing them is really making the decision for them, because they're probably not going to learn unless we tell them about them.
Yeah, I agree.
And that is not our job.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And like Anisio said, we don't know, we can't even begin to know the resources that families and friends of clients might have. So our job is to provide all the information that a client needs to make informed choice.
So that's a very practical example that, with some procedures or policies in place to help staff, to guide staff on what to do. If we don't have a policy or procedure like that, then it's left up to the interpretation of the staff person, and we do jump to those judgments. It's just part of being human. I think that we jump to that and make those decisions, if there's nothing there to guide us with that. So that's the importance, and that's why it's important for us to talk about these kinds of things. So this kind of leads into my next question. In your opinion, in which areas is it most difficult to create policies or procedures? John, you want to start with this?
Boy, I really got to think about that one. I will, just adding on to what you just said about that last one. We just often assume that our staff know what informed consumer choice means, and we don't necessarily train on it. And it is something that we should do. So now, to specifically answer your question, in my experience, the absolute most difficult thing that I have experienced in getting from the writing of a policy to successful implementation is making sure that our frontline folks, our practitioners, get on board with it. And if you really want all your staff on board, that takes a long time to get them on board. And the more you can sell it to them, the more successful it'll tend to be, whatever that policy is. And that really starts with, giving the why. Why are we doing this? What's the clear and convincing evidence that would even want us to be able to do that? And if we can lay that out for staff to show the why this is a good idea, how does it translate to improved services for clients? Because that's what it's all about, right? It's not about us and our other staff. It's about outcomes for clients. So if we can help people understand that and help convince them that this is going to improve that, and then track the data. We're really good across the country in RSA programs on gathering data, but we don't necessarily track it over time so that we see over the course of 3, 4, or 5 years, what kind of a difference did it really make? And if we can do all of those things and put it together into a package, we have a much better chance of our staff embracing the policy change that we're trying to make. So, that's a kind of roundabout way to answering the question. I hope it's the kind of thing that fits the answer you're looking for, Kendra.
I don't know that I had a specific preconceived idea of what the answer should be. So,
Then I'm your guy.
Would you say, John, too, that the other piece is, as you implement a new policy, is to identify within the staff some champions that can bring everybody else along. You always have, what do they call the 20-20, 60 or 10-10, 80 or something like that, and you try to identify those that believe in what you're doing, can understand, they are part of the frontline staff, and can bring some of the other ones more reluctant along by demonstrating how beneficial it can be.
Oh, Anisio, that is such a good and important point. Thank you for saying that, because if you're the champion, you're likely driving the idea, but those people who are going to successfully implement it are the people who are out on the front line. So finding those champions is essential.
So Anisio, go ahead about what you think is most difficult.
For me, I think I was thinking about this, the last couple of days, and I think thinking back, one of the areas that was most difficult for me was when I worked at an agency that had both a center-based and community-based program, and also an agency where when I got there, they already had it, but we tried to maintain a certain level of community where a lot of things happen within that agency, right? In the evening, on weekends, we had movie nights, we had alumni club, we had a lot of things that, not to keep the client stuck with us forever, but really we were providing a lot of different opportunities that they then could go back and enjoy somewhere else. For example, I'll give it the movie night, for example, once a month was really popular because so that's how some of the new clients especially became familiar with audio description, for example. And then we would use that and talk about what they can, how they can access that in various local theaters, etc. What to ask for and how to go about getting it. And so that was just an example of how that was helpful. But on the other hand, it was a recreational piece. The other, combined with that, we had a large number of staff that were blind or visually impaired that also went to those events, sometimes as volunteers because we needed help, other times because they wanted to also enjoy the event itself. And this happened both within the organization and outside, because, you know, again, our blind staff already knew some of these clients before they became involved. So we always had policies about fraternization and, you know, all those types of things that prevented clients from staff from accepting gifts and all that. So that was easy. But the other piece of really maintaining a certain level of confidentiality, distance, professional relationship, that was very hard to do, because again, we didn't want to interfere with that sense of community. And at the same time, we wanted to make sure that obviously we provide professional services and that clients, while they were receiving the service, expected a different type of relationship. So that was hard. I mean, I think we did it, and we did it with a lot of after a lot of discussion among the staff. This is one of those where frontline staff really had a tremendous amount of influence in the way that we designed the policy, etc. And then we talked to other organizations and learned from them. And I think we did it, and thank God we never had any problems that could have arisen from that, from not following the policy.
Mm-hmm.
But it was hard. And I would think that, speaking directly to the folks that you're going to show this video to, this may really be an issue that resounds a lot with the independent living centers, where a lot of the staff are also persons with disabilities. They may already have relationships and connections and in the community with other clients, with other groups, etc. So this is something that really should require the attention of the management of those places and the state to be able to help guide some of those policies, of the development of those policies and procedures.
For sure. That's a very good example. Our last question: share any advice you have about creating or implementing policies or procedures. And John, we'll start with you.
The advice that I would have for program managers is to stay current on your knowledge of your policies and procedures that you have, because they're not set in stone. Those aren't legislation. They're policies and procedures, and they're intended to be fluid so that you can alter them as circumstances around you change, as they surely will. So stay current. It wouldn't be a bad idea to make sure that your staff revisits them from time to time, and get their input, because sometimes they'll have great ideas that, hey, you know, about this certain thing, you know, whatever that thing is, there's really nothing in here that addresses this issue fully. So using especially those champions like Anisio mentioned is always a great way to do it, but it's just critical. You know, I work with states all across the country. And sometimes we have folks, both administrators or frontline people, who haven't looked at their policies in years, and that's a huge mistake. So stay current. The needs of our clients are changing. The needs of our agencies should change as well.
Thank you. Anisio?
Yeah, I agree with with John. From a private sector point of view, I would think that obviously the first thing to take into consideration is what are the policies and procedures of the state that pertain to your program. Since we're talking about OIB and a lot of the funding is coming from the state, it is important not to, from a CRP point of view, not to develop policy and procedures in a vacuum without taking into account the state. So start with the state and then figure out what, as we said before, what works best for the clients, but also identifying some of those champions among the staff to carry out new policies. And the other one is not to be afraid of failure. I mean, that sometimes we may come up with something that with the best intentions and then realize a few months later, well, you know what, we tried, it didn't really work. And then start over and redraw make the changes that are necessary. The other thing that I would say is I always found it very helpful to maintain a close contact with the program manager, the OIB program manager from the state. And because in some of the states where I worked, my agency was just one of the CRPs providing services to older individuals who are blind. And therefore the program manager could be the conduit to share some of the examples, positive and negative, of other providers, perhaps, that we could learn from and not make the same mistakes.
Mhm. That's all very good. Thank you both for being here and sharing your wisdom and your experience with policies and procedures.